All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz. Rabbi Naftali Tilson, Averet Yisrael, for dedicating over Sherman Drushos this month in the commemoration of the yahrzeit of his parents, Rabbi Yonah ben Avraham Leib and Rivka Bas Yaakov Zichronon Bracha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, Meretz Hashem, the Neshamas should have an aliyah and the family Zein Nechama. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Baruch and Bracha Rifkin, for the yahrzeit of Libby Rifkin, Liba Bas Shal Halevi Zichronon Bracha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama have an aliyah and the family in Nechama. And we thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ira and Miriam Grossman, from Eretz Yisrael now, Baruch Hashem, for dedicating the shir and the schus that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bestow shalom upon all of Am Yisrael and all of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Hashem. We will say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Nun Hey 55, and we are picking up Eretz Hashem on Nun Daled Amud Beis 54b. We left off just a few lines up from the bottom, 3 lines up from the bottom. Hahud Asla Kamid Rabbi Avo. So we'll say, remember again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit, we were focused on the machlokes between Abaye and Rava. Now remember again, the Mishnah was speaking about a situation of Kohanim who go ahead and make a carbon pigul. So remember again, under those circumstances, that is still part of the topic of Hezek She'eino Niker, unrecognizable damage, and the liability for that. By the way, just as an aside, we saw yesterday's daf that according to the Rambam paskins that Hezek She'eino Niker, Mid'araisa, one is not chayiv, Midrabanan, one is chayiv if one does it b'mezid, if one does it intentionally. Unintentional hezek she'eino niker. Remember again, definition of hezek she'eino niker: unrecognizable damage. Unrecognizable damage. You change the status of something, but externally one cannot perceive any type of difference in the item. So midaraisa pater, midrabanan. If you do it intentionally, you're going to be chayiv. Along those same lines, you saw the Mishnah of pigul. We then saw machlokes Abaye and Rava, namely again, at what point in time are you permitted or are you believed to change the status of something? So Abaye says, if it's in your possession, literally shebi yado, if it's in your hand, then you are believed to change the status. Rava, you're believed to change the status if you tell the owner of this change the first time you encounter him. But if you don't share it with him the first time you encounter him, then Allah Chalamais, you're not believed. So we then took this discussion over to these interesting cases of Sefer Torah. Right? The first case we saw of a person who goes there, Sofer writes the Torah, and then afterwards he goes in and he tells the owner of that Torah, by the way, the names of Hashem that I wrote inside of it are not written l'shma. Okay, so both say so along the same lines. There was a guy who came before Rabbi Avo. And what happened? Amarle, Sefer Torah shekasafti leploni gvilin shelo lo ibaratem l'shma. So what happened? The Sofer, right, the scribe, person who wrote the Sefer Torah, comes Rabbi Avo. So Sofer will call him Ruvain. Ruvain says, I wrote a Sefer Torah for Shimon, but listen, I have to tell you, the parchment was not tanned lishma. For Sefer Torah, Bosai, you can't just go ahead and buy parchment on eBay and start writing a Sefer Torah, right? The parchment itself has to be prepared with the intention to use it for the mitzvah of Sefer Torah. That is called lishma. Shema. So now what happens in this case? Ruvain the Sofer, right, writes the Sefer Torah, delivers it to the customer, to Shimon, and then after the fact, he comes before Rabbi Avo, and he, quote-unquote, admits that the parchment was not prepared lishma. So the Gemara says, Amarle, Sefer Torah biyadmi. So which Rabbi Avo says to Ruvain, who has the Sefer Torah now? Amarle biyad lokeach. Ruvain says, Shimon, the purchaser, right? The purchaser has it. Amarlo, mitoch sha'ato ne'eman lahafsid scharcha, ato ne'eman lahafsid Sefer Torah. So essentially, Rabbi Avo says to Reuven, he says, look, you're believed. We're going to believe you. Why? Because when you make this statement that the Sefer Torah was not written lishma, that the parchment was not tan lishma, what is Reuven effectively saying? What is he saying? The Torah is invalid. If he says the Torah is invalid, what's the ramification of that statement? He's not getting paid. So such a dramatic statement like that essentially deprives Reuven of his fee. Right? He's not going to get paid for this Sefer Torah because it is clearly invalid since he's believed. So since literally translated, it means once he's believed to deprive himself from his fee, he is believed about the Sefer Torah, which is another way of saying, since the statement itself is going to cause him such a profound loss, we do not assume that a person is going to make up such a statement like that, and therefore he's believed. Top of nun, hey, umayshna bid Rabbi Ami. But I will say, one second. Why is he different than the previous case? Remember, what was the previous case? Reuven the Sofer, right, came before Rabbi Ami. What did he say? The names of Hashem were not written l'shma. And Rabbi Ami didn't believe him. Right? In other words, well, let me add in one piece of information. Rabbi Ami says, who has the Sefer Torah? Reuven says, Shimon. Rabbi Ami says, okay, have a great day. Right? That's it. Nothing to talk about here. So why do we believe Reuven in the second case and not believe Reuven in the first case? So I will say this is incredible. It's possible in the first case that Reuven made a mistake regarding the statement of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi said, now what did Rabbi Yirmiyah paskin? Rabbi Yirmiyah was the one who said that halacha l'maisa, even if for argument's sake a sofer didn't write the names of Hashem l'shma, that is a rectifiable error. Right? How is it rectifiable? You trace over it l'shma. Right? And therefore what? Hacha kevan de kamafsid kule agre va'asa emar kushta ka'amar. So we'll say, now listen to this. So the Gemara wants to make the following distinction. See, let's say a person, here's human nature. Human nature is that sometimes when I really dislike someone, and I want to cause them pain, I am willing to take a small loss to cause someone else pain. Right? Human nature, right? Not the best of human nature, but human nature. What I'm not willing to do is to take a complete loss to cause someone pain. So watch this. In case number one, where Sofer comes along, right? Reuven's delivered the Sefer Torah to Shimon. And then he comes along and he says, by the way, the names of Hashem are not written l'shma. They will say, the Gemara views it as, look, obviously assuming that the Sefer Torah is no longer in his hands, but the Gemara views it as, it's possible he's lying. Now, why would a person make up such a thing like that? Because he wants to cause distress to Shimon. And he's willing to do it because Rabbi say the effect that it has on Reuven will be minimal. Why? Because there's a way to rectify that, or at least he thinks there's a way to rectify it, which is just trace over the names of Hashem l'shma. So because it's going to cause Shimon a lot of agmas nefesh, a lot of inner turmoil, and it doesn't really cost Reuven all that much money, we have to be concerned that he's lying. So therefore, halacha l'maaseh, if it's not in his possession, we're not going to believe him. But we'll say in the second case, where Reuven says that the parchment was not created, was not tanned l'shma, but we'll say, what is the effect of that statement? Total loss. A person's not going to make a statement like that. A person's not going to make a statement like that if it weren't true. In other words, to lose a little bit of money and cost someone else a great deal of pain, that's actually a good deal. That's a good deal. I'll take that deal, right? Unfortunately, some spiteful people will in fact take that deal. A total loss, that a person is not going to do. Hence the fundamental distinction between the two cases. So I will say, so therefore, halacha l'maaseh, that's the distinction between the two cases. I will say, I will tell you. So first of all, let's go back. So that closes out the sugya of hezek she'eino nicker. So I'll say, so remember again, yesterday we already saw the halacha l'maaseh in that sugya. So once again, we paskin hezek she'eino nicker, unrecognizable damage that you visit upon someone else. We paskin mid'araisa, pater, midrabanan, if done intentionally, chayiv, b'shogeg pater. Along those same lines, again, the Rambam paskins based on the Mishnah, if a Kohen intentionally makes a carbon pigel, ultimately again he's going to be chayiv. He's going to be chayiv. This is the Rambam Hilchos Chovel Mazik Perek Zayin Halacha Zayin. If a Kohen makes a carbon pigel intentionally, ultimately again he's going to be chayiv b'shogeg pater. Very important halacha. B'shogeg, if he does it unintentionally, he's going to be pater. Rabbi say, let me share with you one other piece of halacha, then we're going to go on. What about the Sefer Torah case? Because Rabbi say this is a fascinating idea in general. If a sofer comes along and says, after the fact, I did something wrong in the Sefer, do we listen to him or not? So Rabbi say, so I'm going to quote you now from the Shulchan Aruch. Yaredeya, Simin Reish Pei Aleph. Listen to this. Get ready. Sefer Torah. Shamar HaSofer la'achar sheyatsa miyado. They will say, now remember, let's go ahead and point something out over here. In general, if you're in possession of an item, if you're in possession, you are believed to qualify the status of that item, right? So if a Sofer wrote a Sefer Torah and he has it in his hands and he says it's not good, so we believe him. Why? Because again, he has the item. The question really comes up where Sefer Torah wrote the Sefer, gave it to the purchaser, right? So Reuven was the Sofer, gave it to Shimon, and now the Sofer is coming forward with additional information. What do we do with this? So we'll say, now listen to this. Sefer Torah Shamar HaSofer la'achar sheyatzah miyado. Lo kasavti ha'askaros lishman. So we'll say, Sofer goes ahead, Reuven delivers Sefer Torah to Shimon. After Shimon has it, Reuven says, I didn't write the names of Hashem lishma. I didn't write the names of God with proper intention. Eino ne'eman lepaslo. Ultimately, again, he is not believed. He's not believed. Aval ne'emanu lahafsid kol scharo. V'lama eino ne'eman lepaslo. Shemalon is kavin el lahafsid alokeach hazeh. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, we're concerned that halacha l'maisa, he's just trying to cause distress to the purchaser. He's trying to cause distress to the purchaser. And ultimately, again, why is he willing to do this? Because halacha l'maisa says, I'm not going to cost him all that much. Because he thinks he's only going to lose the cost, so to speak, associated with writing the names of Hashem. However, if he makes the claim, after delivering it to Shimon, the parchment was not tanned lishma, was not tanned for the sake of Sefer Torah, then ultimately, again, mitoch sheneman lahafsid scharo, ne'eman lepaslo. They will say in that type of situation where his statement will result in a total loss, then halacha l'maisa, he is indeed believed to say that the Sefer Torah would be possible. So I will say, interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch actually adopts the ending conclusion of this Gemara itself. Beautiful. Mishnah. Hey, Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudguda. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudguda gave the following testimony. Al chareshes she'esiya avia sheyotze beget. So we'll say this is an interesting case. Chareshes is a girl who is a deaf mute. And I will say, now understand something fascinating, which is a father has the ability to betroth his minor daughter, right? That is, and remember, he has the ability to effect on her behalf, biblical marriage. Okay, so now watch this. Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudguda says that a father has the ability to, first of all, marry off his chareshes daughter. Take a look at Rashi. Shesiavia, Rabusa Naka, Ta'avagav de Kabalavia Kidushin Dida Kishikitana, Vahavile Eshes Ishkimura, Afilu Hachi Yotze Begeto Mekabela says Gida, the Afagav de Les Be Daita. Supposed to now listen to this. Here's the novelty in this. Now, a father could go ahead and betroth or marry off his chareshes daughter. Now, I will say minor daughter. Why could he do that? Because remember, again, once a father has the ability to go ahead and marry off his minor daughter, it means that girl, the minor, does not need das. In general, a kitana doesn't have das. So you see that das is not a prerequisite for a father betrothing his daughter. When I say father betrothing his daughter, he's not betrothing his daughter. In other words, betrothing his daughter to another. So it doesn't require das. Doesn't require das, he could even do this if she's a chareshes. That's not the novelty. I will say, what's the novelty? The novelty is that she can get divorced from this marriage when she becomes, when she reaches, the age of adulthood, ultimately by receiving a get. Now we'll say, the chiddush of that Rashi says over, I'm finishing Rashi, the Isha, kinafka bal karka nafka, ve'misratza begerishin, va'afilo hachi nafka, hilkach lo ba'inan daita. But say, this is incredible. The fact that a woman could be divorced against her will indicates to us what? That a woman does not need das for gerushin. Once a woman does not need das, intent, right, for gerushin, since she could be divorced against her will, therefore even a chareshes could ultimately again be divorced. Now I just want to point out, why do we have to set this up as a case of a father marrying off his daughter as a chareshes? Why? Because also remember again, although divorce doesn't need das of the woman, what does need das? Kiddushin, right? You can't get married without das. The only case of marriage that could occur without das, without specific intent, or really without capacity, is a father marrying off his minor daughter. That is a biblical right that the Torah has given to a father, that he has the ability to enter his daughter into marriage without her das. So therefore, Abosai, you could have a case of a father who marries off his chareshes daughter, and that works. She has no das, it's okay. For a father marrying off his minor daughter, das is not necessary. The chiddush is that she could get divorced with a get. She doesn't have das, it's okay. Divorce doesn't require das. Why not? V'haraya, since a husband has the ability to divorce his wife against her will, therefore you see from here that divorce doesn't require das, therefore even a chareshes can get divorced. Incredible, incredible. So the Gemara says, next, v'al ketana bas Yisrael, sheniseis lakoin, shochal b'truma. Now we'll say next case, a ketana. And I will say, now this is talking about a case of also a minor girl who is married off, but in this case, I will say, remember again, she is married off by her mother or brother. Remember again, in the event that the father died, so there's no longer a father in the picture, Chazal made a specific rabbinic right that the mother or the brother have the ability to marry off the minor daughter as well. This was done for the benefit of the daughter, that she would enjoy the financial security of marriage. If they marry her off to a Kohen, she has the ability to eat truma. Eat truma. Now, I will say, Rashi points out what type of truma? Truma d'Rabbanan. Remember again, since she's in a rabbinic marriage, she only has the ability to consume rabbinic truma. Next, B'meisa, and if this girl dies, this minor girl dies in this rabbinic marriage, Baila Yarsha, her husband inherits her. Next, Va'ala Marish Hagaza. I will say, so these are all different cases that Chazal instituted. I will say, this is a great case. Va'ala Marish Hagazel Shabana Babira, She'ital as Damav Mipnei Tachonas Hashavim. So I will say, this is incredible. Imagine the following situation. In general, I will say the halacha is, imagine the following scenario. I go ahead and I go over to Ruvain and I steal Ruvain's watch. And then you know what? I decide, is it not the right way to live? I want to become a Baal Tshuva. So I go over to Ruvain, I say, Ruvain, I stole your watch, I want to become a Baal Tshuva. Here's $1,000 for your watch. Ruvain says, it's on your wrist. Give me back my watch if you're a Baal Tshuva. I say, no, you don't understand. I really like the watch. I'm going to keep the watch. But no one's hanging. But I'm a good guy. I'm really a Baal Tshuva. Here's the value. I want to give you the value of the watch. I will say that does not work. In general, if you steal something and the item is in existence, you are obligated to return the item. I will say there is an exception to this rule. Listen to this case. In this case, Ruvain stole a beam. He stole a beam, a massive beam, a support beam. I will say this was in his Ganav days. And then what did he do? He built it into his home. He built a beautiful new home. And the beam, or what do they call the architecture, or the exposed beams? Is that what it's called? All right, whatever. So what happens? So the beam is right there. You walk into the living room, and mamish, the beam is right there. Now Reuven wants to come Baal Tshuva, right? He learns the halakha. He says, "Oh my gosh, I have to go ahead and deconstruct my home in order to return the beam." The Mishnah says, "No, he doesn't. If you built the beam into the home, you do not have to go ahead and deconstruct the home to return the beam. Why not? Mipnei takanas hashavim. I will say this is a takana, an enactment, so as to facilitate tshuva. I will say, look at Rashi. This is incredible. Rashi made takanas right across in Rashi. Mipnei takanas hashavim shim ato matzricho lekakeh birasau. Because if you tell Reuben he has to deconstruct his home in order to return the beam, olahachzir marish atzmo yimone melasos tshuva. He's not going to do tshuva. See, I will say, the incredible thing is people are willing to do the right thing as long as what? As long as it's not too complicated. The moment that doing the right thing becomes very complicated, most people will just simply walk away. See, if I will say, this is incredible. So we being society, have a vested interest in people doing tshuva. So what we're willing to do essentially is bend the laws a little bit or make exceptions to the normative halacha so as to allow people to do the right thing. So the right thing is, Ruvain, deconstruct your house and give back the beam. It's right there. Give back the beam. But I will say, if Reuven has to choose between being about Shuvah and deconstructing his house, what is he choosing? What is he choosing? He's choosing his house, right? I should say, if he has to choose between staying a Ganav or deconstructing his home and returning the beam, he is going to stay a Ganav. So therefore, I will say, in order to facilitate this Shuvah, we tell him, keep the beam, pay back the value. Incredible. Next, v'achata sagzula shelo nodol rabim. We'll say they also legislated about a stolen chatos. Stolen chatos. That ultimately, again, I will say that was not known to the public. Shimecha Paris. I will say this is incredible. What this sounds like it's saying is, if you bring a stolen chatos, as long as its identity is as a stolen chatos is not known to the general public, ultimately, again, it atones. It atones. Why? Mipnei tikun hamizbeach, for the benefit of the mizbeach. Right, so we'll see exactly what that means. Says the Gemara. Let's analyze. Amar Rava, Meidusa Shav Yochanan ben Gudguda, from Yochanan ben Gudguda's testimony. Amar li Eidim Ru'u get zeshani no sinla. Well, so listen to the following case. Right, Reuven is married to Rachel. He's going to divorce her. Reuven goes over to two witnesses and he says, "You see this get that I'm holding in my hand? I'm going to go ahead and divorce my wife with this get." Okay. Then Reuven goes over to Rachel and he says, "V'chazer v'amerla kinsi shtar chovzeh." So we'll say this is interesting. Now what happens? Now Reuven goes over to Rachel and he says, "Rachel, here, take this document. Take this loan document." So he tells Rachel it's a loan document, right? So we'll say, "What's the ultimately, again, she's divorced. She's divorced. Then we'll say, now what's the logic of this? Milo amrav Yochanan ben Gudguda lo ba'inan daita. Hachanami lo ba'inan daita. Why is it obvious? Because Gerushin divorce doesn't need das. Doesn't need das. Once again, remember, what did Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudguda say in the Mishnah? That when the father married off his Charesha's daughter, that she has the ability to get divorced through receiving a get. She doesn't have das. It's okay. Gerushin divorce does not need intent. Right, does not need mental capacity because she could be divorced against her will. So in this case over here, Reuven takes a get, goes over to witnesses, says, "Witnesses, here, I'm about to divorce my wife Rachel. Here's the get." He goes over to Rachel, he says, "Rachel, this is a loan for you, right, or a loan to you, or a loan document for you." She takes it, poof, they're divorced. They're divorced. To which the Gemara says, Pshita. So I don't understand, like, okay, it's kind of obvious, right? Rachel doesn't need intent, capacity, or even knowledge in order to be able to get divorced. So what's the chiddush over here? To which the Gemara says, no. Ma'odetema, kevan da amar kinsi shtar chovzeh batule batle. See, I will say it's a little bit different because I'll say there's a difference between not having specific intent or das in the context of a divorce process versus husband telling wife that the document he's giving her is something totally other than a get. Right? I might have thought that in this case, in this case where he says to her, acquire this loan document, that's what? Batule batle. Maybe he's changing his mind. He's changing his mind. And even though he told the witnesses this is a get, and obviously it is actually a get, then maybe he's actually changing his mind. Kamash no, im isa de batle li'edim hava amar lahu. So I'll say, if he really wanted to change his mind, who would he have said something to? He would have said something to the witnesses. He would have said to the witnesses, "I know I told you guys I'm giving my wife a get. I changed my mind." So why does he tell her? Why does he tell her that it's a loan document? He's embarrassed. He's embarrassed. Or maybe he's just a wimp, right? In other words, he's not embarrassed. He's probably scared, right? So I'll say, so that's the chiddush over here. The chiddush I'll say in this case is something very interesting that we already knew that in order for a woman to be divorced, she could be divorced against her will. If she could be divorced against her will, then Lamaisa means she does not require das. The chiddush in this case, I will say over here, is active misrepresentation. So I might have thought that active misrepresentation ultimately, again, maybe is a negation of the get process. Kamash Mala, no, if he wanted to negate it, he would have said something to the witnesses. The fact that he told the witnesses, ultimately, again, this is a get, indicates to us that indeed is his das I. So why does he tell her that it's a loan document? He's afraid, he's embarrassed. Good. So let's go back to So I'll say, remember again, next case of Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudguda was that halacha ma'aseh ketana bas Yisrael, which we also remember again as the case, of a mother or a brother who is marrying off this girl, rabbinic marriage, they marry her off to a Kohen, halacha l'maisa, she is permitted to go ahead and eat truma midrabanan. So the Gemara says, ve'ilu chareshes lo achla. Rabbi say, now what we can infer from this is that a chareshes, right, a chareshes, ultimately Rabbi say, now this is talking about a case of a chareshes who marries a Kohen on her own, right, that a chareshes would not be permitted to eat truma if she married a Kohen. So the Gemara says, ve'ilu chareshes lo achla. My time, what's the reason? Shema gzeira shema yachil cheresh bechareshas. Ultimately, I will say we would be concerned about a case of a Kohen cheresh who is married to a chareshes, that he may come to go ahead and give her truma. So the Gemara says, what's wrong with that? What would be wrong with that? After all, that would be no different than katan ochal nevelosu. I will say it should be no different of a child who eats non-kosher food. I will say in general, there are circumstances where literally this is a katan ochal nevelos is an expression that's used that when someone who doesn't have das is doing an avera, sometimes you could just leave it alone. Right? Sometimes there's not an active obligation to intervene. So if a Kohen who's a cheresh is married to a chareshes and he's giving her truma, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? In other words, neither of them have capacity. So the mice, again, it's no different than a child who's eating something non-kosher, which under certain circumstances, sometimes you don't have to intervene. To which the Gemara says, you're right, Gzeira shemiyachil cheresh bepikachos. So we'll say, what we're concerned about is, if you have a Kohen who is a cheresh, married to a woman who is a bikachas, all right, a normal, typical woman, that ultimately, again, he may give her truma. And I will say, now that's problematic. Why would that be problematic? Because halacha l'maisa, since she is a fully normal woman, if she eats truma, even though she's not really married mid'oraisa to the Kohen, that's a real problem. But let her eat truma d'rabanan, let her eat rabbinic truma. Both say, because remember, again, you could affect rabbinic marriage with a cheresh, so let her eat truma midrabanan. To which the Gemara says, "Gzeira shema asi lecho b'truma daraisa." So both say that's what comes down from essentially from this case that Sazar both say. So let's just trace the steps over here. So what the Mishnah told me was that halacha l'maisa, when a brother or a mother marry off their daughter's sister, right, which you could do, and that creates rabbinic marriage. Let's say they married her off to a Kohen, she could eat truma. What kind of truma? Truma midrabanan. So we'll say, essentially what the Mishnah teacher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudah's teaching me is that when you have a rabbinic marriage, so rabbinic marriage to a Kohen allows you to eat rabbinic truma. So it just points out, by the way, there are other cases of rabbinic marriage, right? What's a good case of rabbinic marriage? Cheresh. So it sounds like over here that halacha l'maisa, if a chareshes marries a Kohen, could be you could have a case of rabbinic marriage, but apparently based on the Mishnah, you would not be permitted to eat truma in that case. Why not include the case of cheresh? To which the Gemara says, you're right. The case of cheresh, we're a little bit scared, because if we allow consumption of truma in a cheresh marriage, what we're concerned about, Rabbi say, is the case of a Kohen who is a cheresh who marries a typical normal woman, bikachas. It could be that there could be marriage to Rabbanon, and what we're concerned about in that case is that if we allow for truma consumption, so husband cheresh may come to give his wife truma d'oraisa. Rabbi said, now what happens if she consumes truma d'oraisa? Very severe penalty, right? Why? Because now she is a zar, a non-Kohen, and a woman who's not really married to a Kohen, she's only married midrabanan, consuming truma d'oraisa. That is a very severe penalty. Therefore, what we do is we legislate that in any case of marriage with a cheresh, there is no consumption of truma, even truma midrabanan. Incredible. I'll say next case. Thief wants to become Baal Tshuva, but the beam that he stole, he built into a home. So we do not force him to return the stolen item, but rather, again, we just allow him to pay the value. To which the Gemara says, Tanabanan, Gazal Marish Ubna Babira. If Ruvain is a thief, he steals a beam and he builds it into his home. Beishamai Omrim Mekakea Kolabira Kula Umachsir. Beishamai says, if you want to be a Baal Tshuva, deconstruct your home and give back the beam. So Umachsir Marshal Bailov, Beisila Omrim, Eino ela demei marish bilvad. Beis Hillel says, no, we do not make him deconstruct the home. Rather, we just go ahead and make him pay back the value of the beam, and that is enough. Why? Mipnei takanas hashavin. Ultimately, again, for the benefit, literally, again, to enable, to facilitate, and to encourage people to do tshuva. So we'll say this is it's a fantastic machlokes, and if you think about it, really, what they're machlokes about, I will say, what are they arguing about? They're arguing about what is the definition of a Baal Tshuva, So Beis Shammai says, a Baal Tshuva is someone who eradicates all vestiges of his past life. If you want to be a Baal Tshuva means doing a 180. Anything that was negative in your life, you have to expunge, right? You have to get rid of. And if there's any remnant of your former sinful past, you're not a Baal Tshuva. So therefore, Beis Shammai says, Reuben, you stole the beam, you built it into your living room, right? And you love it because it's the exposed rafters in your living room. So now what happens? Beis Shammai says, every single time you walk into your house, what do you see? The beam that you saw, you're not a Baal Tshuva. You're still tethered. You're still connected to your past. And if you're connected to your past in some way, you paid the value, you are not a Baal Tshuva. Beis Hillel says, so we'll say, Beis Hillel is really saying two things. Number one, I was saying, who says that we have to adopt such a purist model to tshuva? Many times in life, even when I want to turn my life around, it's virtually impossible to eliminate all vestiges of my past. There's always some residual. There's always something left. And often there's always something I can't fully disassociate or just disconnect myself from. So essentially what Beis Hillel says is, do not allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. At the end of the day, it is better to be even a partial Baal Tshuva than no Baal Tshuva at all. So if it's a choice ultimately between becoming a Baal Tshuva who is somewhat tethered to his past versus just remaining a Ganav, then ultimately, again, be a partial Baal Tshuva. Better to affect some component or some element or some part of the process of change than not to affect change at all. He'll say it's such a profound, and again, I also want to point out, this in general is the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai is always the purist. Beis Shammai, which is why I was saying, in the Messianic era, in Moshe Mashiach, we will paskin like Beis Shammai, because in the Messianic era, we have the ability to live up to the standards of the purists. But in the non-Messianic world, you just got to go for good. Great is often not attainable, but really good is very attainable. Beis Shammai is describing the ideal process of tshuva. And Beis Hillel essentially says, I'm with you. But if that's the standard, if that's the gold standard of tshuva, most people won't measure up, and therefore society will have many fewer Baalei Tshuva. So much better to have imperfect Baalei Tshuva than no Baalei Tshuva at all. Let's say in general, this yisod is one of the things that holds us back from accomplishing so many things. I will say, how many times in life do we want to do something? And we say to ourselves, well, you know what? If I can't do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it. And I would say that stems from a good place. That stems from the Beis Shammai aspect of our persona. There's a beauty to that. The problem is we lose out on the accomplishment of so much good if we're only willing to settle for great. And I would say this. So again, the goal is not, we know this. We know this from our own lives. So many things that can accomplish. It's not going to be perfect. You're right. There's nothing in life that's perfect. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu is perfect. Nothing else in this world is perfect. But if you could do something really good, even if it's not going to be great, and even if it's not going to be perfect, go for it. I will say, you see from here also how much society values tshuva. We want Baalei Tshuva. We want people to find the courage to turn it around. So much so that they're willing to let Reuven live with that beam in his living room. He has to give the value. But society has a vested interest in people doing tshuva. Weiter. V'achatas hagzula. We'll say about a stolen chatos. Remember again, so the Mishnah said that you're permitted to go ahead and offer up a stolen chatos. So this would be a case of the chatas is stolen. No, Mishnah said no one knows about it. The rabbim don't know about it. That it's mechaper. Amra ula. Dvar Torah, bein noda, bein lo noda, ina mechaperes. Ula said, really, midaraisa, whether people know about the chata, said it's don't know about it, it's not mechaper. My timer, yeyosh kidei lo kani. I will say yeyosh by itself is not going to. I will say, what's the case over here? The case over here is Ruvain steals a sheep from Shimon. And then what happens? Ruvain decides, you know what I'm going to do with this sheep? I'm going to give it as a chatos. I'm going to be makdish it as a chatos, right? And he offers it up. So now Ula says, whether people know about the stolen sheep, don't know about the stolen sheep, it's not mechaper. It doesn't affect atonement. Why? Because Rabbi say yeyosh by itself, without a transfer of ownership, without a transfer of domain, doesn't affect ownership. So Rabbi say when Reuven steals the sheep, let's say Shimon says, you know what, I'm never going to get it back. So Shimon has yeyosh. He relinquished, right? What does yeyosh mean? Literally, yeyosh means despair. In a halachic sense, what it means is you give up hope of ever recovering the item, thereby relinquishing your ownership rights. So now Reuven has the animal that has undergone yeyosh, but there hasn't been a transfer of domain. So Ula holds that yeyosh by itself, without what we call a shinoi rishus, without a change of domain, does not affect ownership. Because of that, when Reuven is makdish, when Reuven consecrates the animal doesn't become consecrated because it's not really Reuven's to consecrate. Right? So why did Chazal say that if no one knows about the theft, that ultimately again is mechaper? So Kohanim shouldn't be sad. I was in conscious. Let me just play this out for just a second. Reuven steals a sheep from Shimon. Now we'll say what happens. Some time goes by. Shimon doesn't, right? He posted all of his signs on the telephone poles. Have you seen this sheep? Right? He puts a beautiful picture of him and the sheep at one of the family simchas. Right? It's all there. We'll say, so what happens? Now, what happens? Some time goes by. Shimon doesn't get back the sheep. What does Shimon experience? Yeyosh. So I will say, so now what's the problem? So now Reuven has the sheep still. So now the sheep is undergoing yeyosh. But I will say, remember, here's the issue. There's been no shina rishus, no change of domain. So therefore, yeyosh by itself, without a change of domain, does not affect ownership. So now Reuven doesn't really own the sheep. What does Reuven do? He's makdish it. They will say, what does that hegdish do? Nothing. Why does it do nothing? You can only be makdish something you own. So there I will say, but Reuven thinks it did do something, and he was makdish as a chatos. He brings it to the Beis HaMikdash. That gives it to the Kohen shechts it, the Kohen needs to say, what does the Kohen effectively consumed? What has he consumed? Chulin ba'azara. Because remember, they've effectively slaughtered a non-carbonic animal in the Beis HaMikdash, which is a very serious transgression. Now I will say, he can't operate this way because otherwise the Kohanim, so therefore Chazal stepped in and said, no, it is a good carbon. As long as people don't know that it's stolen, we assume again that we essentially make it a valid carbon. And they both say, why did Chazal do this? In order that the Kohanim shouldn't be sad. What's the reason the Kohanim shouldn't be sad? So they both say, Kohanim are not going to want to offer up karbanos if there is this concern of stolen livestock sanctified as karbanos. And then Kohanim are never going to know, is it a valid carbon, not a valid carbon? So in order that, quote unquote, the Kohanim shouldn't be sad, I want to say Kohanim are very sensitive. It's not a joke. Remember again, Kohanim, what are Kohanim known for? Kohanim ragzonim ninu. Kohanim are angry. I will say, anger is passion. Right? The other side of anger, right? The other side of that passion is sensitivity. So Kohanim are very sensitive, very angry, very sensitive. It's like the worst mixture ever, right? Right? Very angry and very sensitive. But it's the two sides of the same coin. So we'll say, because they have this sensitivity, we won't, if a Kohen knows, so we'll say, can you imagine you're a Kohen, some guy walks off the street, right? Come on, so what happened? What does the Kohen do? It's called carbonic profiling. So I'll say, what happens? Yeah, that guy looks like a ganav. He has that ganav look to him. So they're going to be like, should I offer it? Shouldn't I offer it? Did he steal it? Did he not steal it? So Chazal realized you can't operate this way. So instead, what did they do? They said, as long as no one knows that this is a stolen animal, it works. It works. That's Ula. Amr li Rabbanan Ula. So the Rabbanan said to Ula, "V'hanam betikon hamizbeach tanan." But what the Mishnah said, the Mishnah said that Chazal allowed this carbon to be offered for the benefit of the altar. Right? Mizbeach, not the benefit of the Kohanim. Amar Lohem, Kevan the Kohanim atzav and nimsa Mizbeach batal. No, because we'll say if the Kohanim are sad, what's the effect of Kohanic sadness? The effect of Kohanic sadness? Ultimately, nothing gets offered up on the Mizbeach. So that's what it means, we'll say. So in order that the Kohanim don't have to start profiling every single person that comes. And we'll say the effect of that profiling is they're just not going to offer up karbanos because it's too much risk. I will say offering up chulin ba'azara is a very serious transgression. So if I have to choose between offering up chulin ba'azara and just not doing anything, it's not going to do anything. So if Chazal stepped in and said, no, unless you know that something is stolen, assume that it is not, offer it up. This is done for the benefit of the Kohanim, which is in essence the benefit that the Mizbeach will be used. Good. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Dvar Torah, lo no, the mechaperes. Rabbi Yehuda says the truth is, halacha l'maisa, if you have a stolen carbon, whether you know that it's stolen or you don't know that it's stolen, it actually still affects atonement. How so? My taima, yeyosh kedi kani. Because yeyosh by itself, Rabbi say, actually affects ownership. In other words, Rabbi say, according to Rabbi Yehuda, listen to this. When Reuven steals the sheep from Shimon, after Shimon has yeyosh, what happens? Reuven becomes the owner, even without a change of domain. So therefore, I will say, even if the animal is stolen, Reuven is the owner. Again, he owes Shimon money, but Reuven is the owner. And therefore, again, Reuven has the absolute ability to be makdish the animal and bring it to as a carbon. Amud Beis, umatam amlu noda ila mechaperes. And ultimately, so we'll say, why is it in a case ultimately where people know that the carbon is stolen? Why is it know the carbon is stolen that it's not mechaper? Shelo yomru mizbeach ochel gzelos. I will say this makes sense. You can't have stolen offerings being offered up. I will say, because in other words, if people know that it's stolen, I will say, can you imagine? Reuven rolls into the Beis Hamikdash with his stolen sheep. Now remember again, is it his? Is it his? Yes. Remember again, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that yeyosh kedikani. Rabbi Yehuda holds that yeyosh by itself affects transfer of ownership. So once Shimon has despaired of recovering his sheep, Reuven does become the full-fledged owner of that sheep. He's got to pay Reuven for it, but he becomes the owner. Because he's the owner, he has the ability to go ahead and what? To go ahead and offer it up as a carbon. Now, can you imagine? Reuven walks into the Beis Hamikdash. Everyone knows that Reuven's a ganef, but technically speaking, it's his sheep. See, he goes ahead, he offers up the carbon. We'll say it looks terrible. It looks terrible. People are going to say the Mizbeach, right? You could offer up stolen carbonos on the Mizbeach. It's a chilul Hashem. You can't do that. So according to Ula, I understand why we set this up as a case of a chatos. Because Rabbi said again, remember, chatos, a Kohen eats from a chatos. And according to Ula, the whole issue over here is Kohanic sadness. Kohanim won't go and offer up the carbon. So the Gemara, El Rabbi Yehuda, my area chatos, afilu olanam. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi say that this is a din that we don't want them as beach consuming stolen animals. So why do you have to set it up as a chatos? You could also set it up as a case of an olah. Afilu olanami. Tushimar says, you're right. Let me buy kamar. Let me buy olah the kaluhi. But it goes that saying olah, which is totally consumed on the mizbeach. That of course we can't have the mizbeach consuming stolen items. Ela afilu chatos nami dechila v'damhu desar lagav mizbeach. Even a chatos. When a chatos will say the only thing that's happening on the mizbeach is what? Is the chila of the fat, the dam, the blood, right? V'idach kohanim achlile afilu hachi gazer shelo yomru mizbeach ochal nevelos. Rabbi Yehuda will still say about even in the case of a chatos, where there's a relatively small amount of the animal actually consumed on the mizbeach, we still have a concern that if the animal is stolen, and everyone knows about it, that it looks like the Mizbeach is consuming stolen items. Okay, so Tanan, Achatas Agzula Shalono Delarabim Shimechaperes, and Etikun Mizbeach. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said, if you have a stolen chatos, right, that is not known to the rabbin, people don't know about it, so the Mishnah says it is mechaper for the benefit, right, Etikun Mizbeach. Benefit of Mizbeach. So Gemara says, Bishlam Ula Necha, according to all this makes sense. El Rabbi Yehuda ipchami baile, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, we'll say it should be just the opposite. To which the Gemara says, "You're right." Hachin nami kamar. This is what it means to say. Lo noda mechaperes. if no one knows about the fact that this animal is stolen, it's mechaper. Noda, eno mechaperes. But ultimately, I will say, if it's known that it's stolen, it won't be mechaper. Why? Rabbi say this is the takana. The takana is that people should not see the mizbeach consuming stolen karbanos. So ultimately, again, we'll say, see, according to Rabbi Yehuda, technically speaking, any stolen chatos should ultimately be mechaper. Whether people know about it, people don't know about it. Why? Because once there's been Yeush, the carbon actually becomes the real property of Ruvain. And if it's real property of Ruvain, ultimately, again, the carbon works. The takana is, if everyone knows that it's stolen, it will not be mechaber. Why? Because people shouldn't think that the mizbeach consumes stolen property. So Masiv Rav raised the kasha, Ganav v'hekdish v'achar kach tavach. So it was an interesting case. Ruvain steals an animal from Shimon, and then he's makdish it. Then he consecrates it, and then he slaughters it and sells it. And I remember again, halacha l'maisa, there's a bunch of stuff going on over here. When you steal something, there's generally a penalty of kefel, a double payment. If you steal something, slaughter it and sell it, then what? There's arba v'chamisha, 4 and 5 time penalty payment. Here the timeline is very important. Reuven stole an animal, right? Stole a sheep from Shimon. Then what did he do? What was next? That's step 1. Step 2, he's makdish it, he consecrates it. After he consecrates it, I will say, then he sells it or slaughters it, right? So I will say, so what's the halacha? Mishalim tashlumei kevel, he has to pay double payment to Shimon. Ve'eno mishalim tashlumei arba v'chamisha, but he doesn't pay the 4 or 5 time penalty payment. Rabbi say, why not? Because when he slaughtered and sold it, whose property was it? The Beis Hamikdash. The penalty payment of 4 or 5 times only applies to another individual, does not apply to the Beis Hamikdash. The Tani Allah, but we learned about this. Bachutz ki agavna anush karis. We'll say if you did this outside of the Beis Hamikdash, bachutz, right? Rashi says ishakat bachutz. If you shechted this animal outside of the Beis Hamikdash, right? Ultimately, again, you're chayiv karis. So I'll say, so now watch this. You're chayiv karis. Now, amrit yeyosh kedei lokani. So I'll say, if you hold that halacha l'maisa, yeyosh by itself, ultimately, again, is not kona, that means Ruvain was not really the owner of this sheep. So why would there be a chayiv karis? I will say, now, if he wasn't the owner, then what? Then his hekdish was invalid. If his hekdish was invalid, so we'll say, if his hekdish was invalid, then he didn't shecht a sacrificial animal outside of the Beis Hamikdash. If he didn't shecht, right, because if he didn't own it, he can't be makdish it. So we'll say, so again, I see some blank faces, let me go back. Ruvain stole an animal from Shimon, stole a sheep. We'll say step 1. Step 2, he was makdish it. Step 3, he slaughtered and sold it. So now what did the Gemara say? He's chayiv kefel, he's chayiv double payment. That's from the act of theft from Shimon. But I will say, but he is not chayiv arba v'chamisha. He's not chayiv the 4 or 5 time penalty payment. Why? Because that's a knas. You don't pay a knas to the Beis Hamikdash. Fine. But I will say, however, the Gemara says, if he slaughtered it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, he's chayiv kares. And I will say, now why? Because slaughtering a sacrificial animal outside of the Beis Hamikdash brings with it a chayiv kares. Now says the Gemara, now watch this. Now this makes sense. Now I will say, if you hold that Yehush by itself does not affect ownership, then what? Then ultimately, why would he be chayiv kares? So kares ma'avidite, because I will say, if Yehush by itself doesn't affect ownership, that means that what? Ruvain never acquired it from Shimon. If he's not the owner, then what? Then the hekdish is inconsequential, and therefore again, there's no kares. So Rav Shizvi, kares midivreim. So Rav Shizvi says, what are we talking about? Kares midrabanan. So the Gemara says, achichu alei. They laughed at Rav Shizvi. Kares midivrei miika. What's say? Kares midrabanan. What does it mean, kares midrabanan? You don't get invited to Kiddush on Shabbos after davening? What does that mean, Kiddush midrabanan? Right? It's kares midrabanan. So what does that mean? So miika, amrluhu Rava. Well, says this. Rava said, kavra rabba amr milsa. First of all, Rava says, number 1, when a great person says something, don't laugh. So in general, that's just good etiquette. Right? That's just good etiquette. A good person says something, don't laugh. But furthermore, I will say there's another reason, aside from the good etiquette, is because often great people possess wisdom that often transcends what we simple people understand. And even if something does not make sense to my simple mind, doesn't mean that it's not true. So think about, listen to this. Kares sha'al yidei divreim basalo. Ultimately, I will say, what did he mean when he said, what did Rav Shizim mean when he said, kares midivreim? He says, kares that occurs as a result, sha'al yidei divreim. Kares as a result of a rabbinic law. What does this mean? Ukmua rabbanon birshusei ki hechi dilechayev Allah. Rabbi will say, what did Chazal do? Sometimes Chazal put something in your possession in order that you should become biblically liable. In other words, I will say, even if you hold that halacha l'maisa, that yeyosh kedei lo kani, that yeyosh by itself does not affect transfer of ownership. What Chazal did was, for liability purposes, they made it as if it was yours. Now that they made it as if it was yours, when you are makdish it, it's a proper hekdish, and not only that, but what? But halacha l'maisa, now when you shecht, and now when you makdish it, it's you, right? Proper hekdish, and now when you shechted it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, that is shchutei chutz. And therefore there will be actual kares for that. But I will say, but the kares occurred because of a rabbinic law. What's the rabbinic law? The rabbis put something in your possession that really biblically was not yours. Yeyosh by itself does not normally affect ownership, but Chazal made it as if it did, therefore it's yours, therefore the hektish works, and therefore when you go ahead and you shecht it outside, it's shchutei chutz. Incredible. Ke'echi d'lechayev Allah, Amar Rava, havadai kami bayali. This is certainly a question. Ki ukmar rabbanan b'rshusei, when Chazal put this animal in your rishus, mishas geneva or mishas ekdisha, did they put it in your rishus, Rabbi say, from the time of theft or from the time of that you made it hekdish? Rabbi say, the my nafkamina, what does this matter? Legizusa v'vladoseha. Ultimately, again, for shearings and for offspring. So Rabbi say, so here's the interesting part. So here Rabbi say, so we're being introduced to something very interesting over here. Rabbi say, in general, we paskin that yeyosh by itself is not enough to affect ownership. So we'll say, so yeyosh only affects ownership when there's a shinui rishus, a change of domain as well. So I'll say, yet what we begin to see over here is that when you steal an item, right, Reuven steals an item, and then ultimately again he's makdish it, Chazal penalized him. And how did they penalize him? They put it in his rishus, they made it as if he's the owner, even though again he's not actually the owner. So we'll say, now here's the shaila. When Chazal penalized him and put this property in his possession so that now he is the owner, at what point does he become the owner? Is it now retroactively from the time that he stole it, or only from the time that's what? Only from the time that he was makdish it. Rabbi say, what's the nafkamina? The nafkamina are any additional shearings or if the animal gives birth, who owns that? If you hold it as from the time of hekdish, then any shearings or any births, ultimately, again, until that time, belong to Shimon, the original owner of the animal. If it's from the time of theft, then the only thing Reuven owes Shimon is the value of the animal at the time of theft. Any subsequent shearings or births will actually belong to Reuven, the thief himself. So the Gemara says, "My Hadam Rava mistabra mishas ekdisha shelo yechote nisker." Rava says, "Bepashtos, what it means is it becomes the property of Shimon. We put it in Shimon's possession from the time of the hekdish, in order that Shimon not benefits from his act of theft." See, Rabbi say, if you put it in his possession from the time of the theft, then halacha l'maaseh he'll benefit ultimately from any shearings or any births. In order that he not materially benefit from this act of theft, we only put it in his possession ultimately again from the time of hektish. Therefore, I will say, what comes out over here from the sugi is something very interesting. When Reuven steals an animal from Shimon, I will say, so even when Shimon experiences yeyosh, right? Shimon never hopes to get it back. He gives it, which essentially means what? He yields ownership. But I will say, but the only way that Reuven actually acquires that animal is if that animal leaves his possession and then comes back in a shinui rishus, or it doesn't leave his possession, a change of domain. A change of domain. Without a change of domain, Reuven does not acquire it. It's not his. The exception to this rule, I will say, only is, when is the exception to this rule? If Reuven is makdish it. If Reuven's makdish the animal, then we'll say, technically speaking, that hegdish shouldn't work, because you can't be makdish something that is not yours. But for the purpose of penalizing Ruvain, Chazal made it as if it is his, that the hektish can work, and if Reuven ends up shechting it, ultimately again he'll be chayiv kares. So I will say a lot to digest. We'll stop over here for today. I will say tomorrow, coming attractions for tomorrow. Tomorrow, Kamsan Bar Kamsa. Right? I will say an incredible, dramatic way Mir Hashem to prepare us for the Bein HaMetzarim. I will say shkoyach.
Good thing that's it. Everybody tomorrow.
Get prepared. Get prepared.